All right, we're back. So, about 11 months ago or so, I uploaded a video to this channel about basically my first impressions about our boy Godwyn here and why he looks the way he does. I spitballed through it quite a bit. I made some pretty baseless assumptions. You see me discover the eyes over there for the first time. And overall, it's a pretty juvenile video. I mispronounced the word scion, so there you go. I know how to say that now. At least I got some character development this past year, huh? um, but because Elden Ring was barely a month old at that point, we didn't know a whole lot. So I think that video was decently received because people just didn't know a lot for a while. But now that we know more, and the lore hunters and the community as a whole have more insights into Godwyn and his corpse, that video is very juvenile and very just amateur by comparison. I mean, it still is. This is still going to be pretty juvenile. I don't have any editing software or anything. You're not going to get big sweeping shots of the corpse, and all that. But I wanted to get my thoughts out there because the DLC was announced today, and I want to put these thoughts out before we possibly get more insight into death. Because in Elden Ring, death is something we still know. It's still a bit of an enigma. There are multiple kinds of death. There are multiple monikers for death. Those who live in death, those who are lost in death. We have the worm faces and their whole deal. We have the basilisks. We have Ghost Flame, Death Blight. There's a lot of death and not a lot of explanation. So, you can see I'm themed for this one. But that's neither here nor there. I want to talk about what I think is going on with Godwyn here. My current theory, my new belief, and again, it's just my opinion. Feel free to tout yours, and I say tout, but feel free to give yours. Feel free to talk about others. It uses some information from Smotown and a little bit of Zuli regarding the miasma theory. I might get to that, I'm not sure. But my current belief is that Godwyn's corpse looks the way it does because it is being inhabited by the outer god of death. Godwyn is the outer god of death's champion, for lack of a better word, in my opinion, and thus it has changed his body to look this way. And now that I've given that, I have to back it up, so let's get started. So first and foremost, the item that really got me thinking on this was the Twin Bird Kite Shield, dropped by the Deathbird in Altus. And the important thing here is, the Twin Bird is said to be the envoy of an outer god and mother of the Deathbirds. It does not specify what outer god, but I think it's fair to say that it's the outer god of death. Which, in fairness, it's an outer god that nobody talks about, we never hear about it, whatnot. Some people don't think there can be an outer god of death because of one reason or another, but I believe there is. If there's an outer god of blood and an outer god of rot, there can be an outer god of death, I feel personally. And speaking of those first two, the Formless Mother and the Scorpion, as I'm going to call it, they both, of course, have powerful champions in the form of Malenia and Mohg. Right? So, we have a little bit of a pattern established here. The outer gods latching onto powerful individuals of the golden lineage, or even that are related to the golden lineage, because Malenia is, I believe, a descendant of Radagon specifically, not so much Marika. It's either that or it's Radagon. I think it's Radagon and America she was a child of, because she was supposed to be the grandest of all before the rot overtook her. But we have a pattern here. Mohg was a part of the Golden Lineage, but he was, of course, exiled for being an omen. And then, of course, he made contact with the Formless Mother after accepting his curse. And then, of course, Melania with the outer god of rot and rot in general. And then we have Godwyn. And because Godwyn was the first demigod to die, not fully die, but die, I think he's a perfect candidate for the outer god of rot to champion, basically. Because his terrestrial body is still here. Ranni's body is, of course, a dried husk at the top of the Liurnia Tower, or the Carrion Tower, so she's not much use. Her body isn't much use to it. But Godwyn's can be used. The only problem, of course, is that it's not moving. Right. Well, obviously. But the gist is, because Godwyn's body is still living, it can be used as a vessel. But because it can't move, the outer god of death uses underlings to spy on the lands between above. And we're going to get into that a little bit later because it is kind of relevant to what's going on here. But first I want to give just a little overview, just for the people who may not know or may not fully remember. Godwyn was the first of the demigods to die. He was killed on the Night of the Black Knives when one half of the curse mark of death was carved into his flesh, meaning he died in soul alone. So this form here, this body is still alive, but there's no soul in it. It's, of course, the soulless demigod. Right. In the story trailer, we see the moment Godwyn dies. He's wearing those bracelets. He has what looks like a bit of a blindfold on, or it's just his hair. And it's very similar to how it looks right there. And he's wearing that blue shroud. When he dies, you see this something stirring inside him, and it leaks out of his eyes. It's almost like he's crying. You see what look like little mites scurrying around inside his body, and then this liquid pours out of him, which I believe is Deathblight, in its early form. As for the bugs and such, I believe it has to do with Kagare, and I believe it also has to do with the miasma theory of alchemy, at least in that time where alchemists and just people of that time believed that dead, decaying things just spawned flies and insects, rather than flies and insects being attracted to them. Which I think I think the miasma theory is on full display here as like a fact of the world when you realize that Deathblight, the thorns on it, are fly wings, as you can see here. They're insect wings. And a big thank you to Zuli the Witch for that, because otherwise I certainly wouldn't have thought about it. We'll get into the Kagare aspect of it later, and it's thanks to Smotown that particular thing was brought to my attention. But basically, I feel like that liquid is Deathblight in its purest form prior to the Tarnished appearing. Because I do believe that the gold that is within Deathblight now didn't come about until the Tarnished entered the lands between. Essentially. Now I do have a timeline, in my head at least. Oh boy. Sorry, my cat was trying to get in. I do have a timeline in my head about like how the Deathblight appears and when the death beings begin to appear. And I might do a video on that, but I'm not 100% sure. It just depends on if anybody wants it, but, it's whatever. Anyway, all that aside, all that rambling and spitballing aside, I want to talk about, of course, the whole reason we're here, Godwyn's corpse. And the very first thing I'm going to talk about are his arms. I'm basically going to go down the list of his body here. It has to do with the arms and the eyes, basically, but more specifically, the arms at the moment. Obviously, his whole form is aquatic. You have, like, the clamshell head, the fishtail, the really small head-to-body ratio, the almost vestigial arms. He's very primordial looking, which has also led some people to believe that he's being affected by the Crucible. Which, yeah, there's an argument to be made there, but we're not here to talk about that right now. First and foremost, I want to talk about his arms. And I actually don't... Oh, I do. His arms, of course, are webbed, his arms and his fingers, and they are very similar to the basilisks. Now, basilisks are one of the creatures that serve the outer god of death. They essentially act as, at least I believe, his watchful eyes. They allow him, or it rather, they allow the outer god of death to spy upon various areas of the lands between. This, I believe, is why the basilisks have had their appearance changed. Anyone will know their eyes are a little more, like, gross in this game. And, of course, they do also spew death blight. So I believe that the basilisks are in places of interest to the outer god of rot. Or of death, I'm sorry. You have... Let's see. There are a couple in... I want to talk about, like, the more obscure one first. There are a couple in Volcano Manor. In, like, this really out-of-the-way place. But they are near Volcano Manor. They're in the Shaded Castle. They're in the Subterranean Shunning Grounds. They're in the Lake of Rot. And, of course... Whoops. They are all over the Deeproot Depths. I believe that they are meant to be watching places of interest for the outer god of death, whether that be to watch Moog or the copy of Moog, and by extension the Frenzied Flame in the Shunning Grounds, or Rykard in Volcano Manor, and of course as like a warning to the outer god when we or other Tarnished appear here, just because of the sheer amount of basilisks in the Deeproot Depths. Now, so they're very important, basically. And I think that importance is, in a way, reflected on the body here. Just based on the arms, and especially the eyes. The eyes are particularly important because, and I did not know this when I first looked at the corpse. They are all over the lands between. Now everybody knows this by now. This isn't like amazing news, but these eyes are all over the lands between. And so it's clear to me that these eyes are meant to keep watch over the land. And of course the basilisks have the same eyes, but the difference is that they are mobile, whereas the death root growths are not. So the basilisks are very important to the outer god of death, I would imagine, because of their mobility. And thus, they are reflected in the arms and even the torso a little bit. Next, the torso isn't of much interest, other than, you know, this is where the Deathblight exudes from. But the torso is of no interest to me, at least at the moment. It's not really. We are now going to talk about the tail. The tail and the head are by far the most perplexing parts of the corpse. Pardon me. And the tail is very difficult to place, but I think I have a working theory. A theory that isn't too ridiculous. Alright. The tail, I believe, is perhaps a representation of Kigare, and might have something to do with the Deep from Dark Souls 3, which also deals with Kigare. Now, another theory I've heard that I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it were, you know, it's a theory that I'm fine with, I think it works decently enough, is that Godwyn's form overall almost mirrors a, like, twisted Elden Beast in a weird way. And so I could see the tail and the head and whatnot with a somewhat similar, like, stance and whatnot. At least a similar aquatic vibe. I could see that being the case. Because the Outer God of Death is powerful. Everything dies, even if they don't stay dead. But my theory is that it mostly has to do with Kagare. And for those that don't know, Kagare is basically the Shinto... It's more of a Shinto belief of stagnation. It is something that the From Software series has dealt with pretty heavily in other media. It is in Dark Souls 3. It is featured heavily in Sekiro. Sekiro, whatever. Sekiro. And even in Elden Ring, it's touched on through poison, rot, and of course the death blight. But I believe that there are parallels that can be drawn between Godwyn's form, Kagare, and the Deep from Dark Souls 3. The Deep is basically a pocket of the abyss that has been subjected to... It's basically a stagnant pocket of the abyss, and was meant to drown out the current world order or the Age of Fire, which is kind of like what Fia wants to do in this game, or, Godwyn, the Outer God of Death, and whatnot. Drown the current age in death, basically, or living in death, or what have you. But you have a deep body of water filled with stagnation, filled with Kagare. Kagare is basically the corruption of something that is pure. So, for example, let's say you have a flowing pool of water, right? If the water is flowing, it is constantly moving, and therefore it is clean, it is pure. If you have, let's say, now the water here is flowing, but let's say, for example, you have a still pond, you have still water, then you have stagnation. You have a place where insects and like mosquitoes and maggots can incubate because the water is not flowing, and thus you have stagnation. You have Kagare. And in Shinto in particular, they believe in like water spirits and what have you, and Kagare will damage those spirits and thus corrupt them. And I believe that is quite possibly a inspiration, I suppose, for Godwyn's entire design here. He is stagnant, infected Kagare, and it has caused him to morph into this twisted form. And that is something that Smotown talks about, and it's something that I could definitely see it. Definitely. But I also want to talk about how... And even in Kagare, you have, like, putting dead bodies, excrement, just human bodily fluids and waste is Kagare, but also discarded trash and whatnot is as well. And there's a lot of Kagare in this area. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's, like, the big reason Godwyn looks the way he does here. But I do believe that this is the result of the Outer God of Death. I'm sorry to ramble a bit. I know this isn't an organized video, but I wanted to get my thoughts out there kind of quickly. And so things are a bit jumbled right now. It is currently 11:40 at night. I am sleep deprived. This is what you're getting. But anyway, let's move on to the face now. The final, most mysterious part. Now, of course, we know there are two Godwyn faces. There's one beneath Stormveil, then you have the one here. As for the one in Stormveil, I believe that that is potentially where Godwyn was killed. And because the Death Blight began to seep out of his body immediately, I believe that that spot is where he died, and so that is why that face is there. Because the Death Blight has had time, and the Death Root has had time to grow into that. Because if you look at the Prince of Death pustule, and if you look at the crabs in the Altus Plateau, and there's one in Liurnia near Tibia Mariner, they also have Godwyn's face on. See. The corrupted visage of one unable to die a true death, and you can see Godwyn's face on there. Comes from the Prince of Death. So, Godwyn's face is growing in multiple places. And those places, in addition to acting as other places he can spy on, also, they're basically growing into perhaps usable copies of Godwyn that might be mobile, and useful little tools for the Outer God of Death. But as for his face here, as for his whole form, I believe that because the Outer God of Death has chosen Godwyn as his champion, or its champion, sorry, this is, I think, a merge between what Godwyn looked like and what the Outer God of Death's terrestrial form looks like. And you may wonder what I mean when I say that. Like, why? What do you mean Outer Gods don't have form in the real world? They just have champions. It is thanks to Smotown that I bring this up. But in the Grand Cloister, you get the Scorpion Stinger, which its item description states, basically, that the Scorpion was a terrestrial form of the Outer God of Rot. A blind swordsman destroyed this Scorpion, and that is partially why the Outer God of Rot chose Melania as its champion, because Melania was the student of that same swordsman. So with that we know that if not all Outer Gods, some Outer Gods can take terrestrial form in the lands between. And I believe that Godwyn here is a merging between Godwyn the Golden and the physical form of the Outer God of Death. You have this crown of thorns basically all around. You have even like this coral sort of crown upon his head here. You have just a very abstract appearance, very aquatic. Because I believe the Outer God of Death would be an aquatic figure. Because death and water go hand in hand. The vestigial arms, just the big head. I believe that if we were to see the terrestrial form of the Outer God of Death, it would look exactly like this, without the golden hair, bracelets, or blue, basically death shroud or tunic. And probably wouldn't have like the tan coloring we see here. I imagine it would look more like the face beneath Stormveil, with the Deathblight coming out of the top of the head, and the maybe more shrunken form, perhaps. But that, at the end of that rant, it feels like a rant. I hope it's more structured, but it feels like a rant. That is my belief on what Godwyn is now. I believe that is why he looks the way he does here. And I am intrigued to see what this DLC brings, because while I do believe it might be Miquella's corrupted dream, and perhaps mixed with Godwyn's corrupted dreams, because the two are intertwined in a way, somewhat. That is my belief on why Godwyn looks the way he does now. Just to reiterate one more time, I believe that Godwyn's corpse is a mixture of Godwyn and the Outer God of Death. And that is why it looks the way it does. So, that's it. That's all I have for you today. I hope, those of you who see this, I hope you enjoy. It'd be cool if you agreed with me, but obviously you don't have to. I don't claim to be right. I am not infallible. Everybody has a theory. I know Smotown has a theory. More popular lore hunters than I, people who lore hunt for like a living on YouTube basically, have put out their own theories as well. But that's mine. The last video on this did pretty well. Hopefully this one does well as well. Haha. So, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you want me to clarify some things? Again, I know this video was so rambly, and I'm so sorry for that, but I wanted to get all my thoughts out there quickly. I also want to talk about the worm faces in another video, and I probably will, because I do have a theory that I think is a bit more solid on why they look the way they do and what they are. It's a little more mundane than you might think, but that's what I got for you today. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.